This is Banjo with another example in defensive air combat maneuvering. In this example I'm facing off against a single F-15. I can deploy any number of defensive maneuvers as a single ship flight, as I don't have wingmen to protect. Though if I were in a multi-ship flight, I'd be leaving the fight when I went defensive, which would leave my wingmen vulnerable. Today in this example, the enemy flight is off to my 10 o'clock, and they're about to fire a missile on me shortly. When they launch, I'll recognize the launch and immediately break defensive, but I'm going to do so using high G maneuvering, countermeasures, changing my aspect, and trying to spend as little time going defensive as I can so I can press the fight right back to the enemy, leaving my flight for as little time as possible. As I break defensive, I'm going to acquire the enemy and fire on him, forcing him to go defensive as well. In the example, we're both single-ship flights and I don't have wingmen to worry about, but the difference in relation to the previous defensive maneuvers I've covered should be quite clear. It's right about here that the enemy fires on me, and it doesn't go active for a moment or two. So I roll in to take the shot and I increase throttle to get a little airspeed on the missile and make sure I don't lose airspeed while I maneuver. Then I break defensive. I release countermeasures, being chaff, and change aspect as I decrease altitude. I change aspect a couple of times, and a high G maneuver away from the path of the missile. At this point, I've evaded the missile, and I'm turning back in to reacquire the enemy and press the attack. The enemy is already engaged defensive because of the missile that I had inbound on him, which went pitbull right off the rail, as it was within 20 kilometers, which is more or less the range that the R-77 will go pitbull. We'll skip ahead a little bit, as he's finishing up his defense and he's about to try and press an attack on me. At this point, I acquire him on the radar, try and pick him up with a vertical scan. We go back to BVR, set the antenna to the right altitude, find him, lock him up, fire a missile. Right as he's about to try and press the attack on me, but he has no time and he's forced defensive, but due to the loss of his airspeed, the missile strikes him out of the sky. As usual, we'll take a look at this in TAC view next. We'll speed it up to just prior to the launch, as there's nothing different here. I beam him off to my 10 o'clock and reduce the closure rate and let him come into my area to fight, just over the mountains. At this point I've got him acquired, and I'm trying to line up a shot, but as always the F-15 will usually get the first shot. And at this point I recognize the launch and break defensive. Here we're able to see as I get my shot off, then I split over, release the countermeasures, and start changing my aspect around. We're able to see that I defeat the missile quite early on with the chaff and the change in my aspect. And it's at this point that the enemy is engaged defensive, and I'm already turning in to press the attack. This point the enemy is on the defense and I'm on the attack. He doesn't really stand much of a chance unless he can evade that missile quickly, turn around and crank out another missile on me. The enemy drags out my missile and releases a wave of chaff behind him, so we'll speed this up until he turns hot on me. And I can just hear him starting to spike my radar warning receiver, so I can immediately lock him up and fire out a missile on him. He's immediately engaged defensive before he can line up a shot on me, and due to his loss in airspeed, the missile takes him down. Next we'll see a second example. This next example plays out a lot like the first one, except the enemy does have a bit more fight to him. We're seeing the same thing play down. I have him at my 10 o'clock, and he's going to fire a missile, at which point I'm going to break defensive, but not before I get a shot out on him. As you should always take a shot whenever you can when you're breaking defensive, as it will force your enemy defensive, rather than pressing an attack on you while you're busy evading his missile. And here we are at the point that I break defensive, line him up as best I can, get the shot off, and then break defensive. So split down, release countermeasures, change my aspect around a couple of times, and defeat that missile as quickly as I can. You can see that it takes a few more seconds than it did before, but it's still reasonably easy to defeat that missile very quickly and press the attack back towards the enemy. Though the enemy managed to do the same thing and is pressing the attack back towards me, so at this point we're pretty much going hot on each other again. The problem this time is it takes me a moment as I fumble with my radar, and the enemy doesn't, so he locks me up and gets the first shot a second time. Lucky for me, I chose the area to fight, specifically for the fact that I could mask any missile behind terrain within about 2 seconds of noticing the launch. As we're able to see, we got a launch warning, so I immediately roll over and dive to hug the terrain as best I can, forcing that missile to break its lock and run into the terrain. At this point, well within visual range, coming over this hill is going to be dangerous because I don't really know his aspect or where he is. So at this point I'm going to look at my receiver, see where he is. So there he is. Now I'm going to see he's about my 12 o'clock, now he's off to my 9. He's going to fire a heater at me, so I'm going to put out flares. There it goes. And I may turn into him and deny him a shot, as he is now too close for heaters, and he doesn't have a shot for guns. At this point he can't out-turn me, so he's going to try and climb. And all I have to do is get him within 45 degrees of the front of my aircraft and fire an off-bore sight shot with an R-73. Unfortunately, I'm bleeding my airspeed off quite quickly as well. The R-73 is a very great missile, and firing it off-bore sight works very well, and it's quite IR resistant. The enemy tries to defend, but doesn't do so successfully, and I splash him out of the sky. We'll finally look at this example in TAC view. As usual, we'll skip to the point of launch. At this point, we can see the enemy launches an A-120C at me, and I recognize the launch, break defensive. Your best chance at a successful defense is to recognize the launch before it goes active, which will be somewhere around 8 to 10 nautical miles, something like 22 kilometers or so. With our missiles going active at 20, though being more effective somewhere around 15, we'll fire one and break defensive, as we don't need to support it, so it'll go active straight off the rail. I'll make sure I'm operating on the limit of my performance, putting out countermeasures, and employing all the tricks I can, using as little time as I can, to evade that missile successfully, as to support my flight if I was flying with wingmen. At this point I've evaded the missile, and the enemy more or less has as well, and are both turning back onto each other to reacquire each other and press the attack, this time at shorter ranges, making response time shorter, and probability of kill higher. Since I don't have an altitude advantage, I have to make good use of my available airspeed and the terrain available below me. As we're able to see, I mask behind a hill to evade the lock of the second AIM-120 that he fires, and dive it into the side of that hill. At this point I know for a fact that the enemy has a good chance of firing an IR-guided missile at me as I come over this hill. So I set it up so that I have IR flares in the path that the missile has to take to intercept my aircraft, giving a high probability to evade the missiles through the use of the IR flares. At this point we enter into the merge, and the final threat I avoid is guns, as he could line me up and take a gunshot at me. He's going too fast to be able to cut my turn, so I cut his turn, lock him up, and fire an off-bore sight shot with the Archer. We're able to see that it flies true and takes him out of the sky, and his IR countermeasures do nothing to evade the threat.